Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Here I am sitting in the den with my lovely aged scotch, having a sip and pondering the world. Now, one of my ponderings has led me to Warhammer and the end times. So I have assembled a group of my esteemed philosopher colleagues, and we will regale you with tales of woe and whimsy and drama as it lays out in the saga that is the end times. So, let me begin by introducing you to my esteemed colleagues, beginning with Vince Venturella.
Hello. Boy, what a fantastic pickup that was for me after your most beautiful opening there, Kieran, for that to pick up with. For me to let it sit there and die for 20 seconds. Yes, I am Vince Venturella, and I am one of the philosophers here in this discussion. The world is ending, though few would believe it. We are all gathered here, much as the French philosophers in the 17th and 18th century would have gathered in their own salons to discuss the most important issues of their day. So too do we face our own enlightenment, the end of the world that is the end times, or the end of the Warhammer world at least. And that's what we're here to talk about.
Very good. And our other esteemed philosopher, Joshua, please.
Well, I am Joshua, more commonly known as Matiram, because I am a common man, and I am here to speak for the proletariat. Far too many of these apocalyptic conjurings have focused entirely upon those in power and those who command this world of Warhammer from the tournament scenes. And so it is only appropriate to have a voice of the common man, the working man, come and truly uncover the secrets of Nagash and the end times.
Good. Well, I should be very clear to our listeners from all parts of the globe that we are here not to discuss the action and rabble that goes on in the battlefields of Warhammer, nor are we here to go into the minutiae of rolling of dice and nonsense like that. We are simply here to regale you with the tales and discuss the background and the stories and the richness that is the Warhammer world in the end times. Now, opening our discussion, I think it would be worthy, or rather my colleague Vincent believed that it would be very worthy, to discuss why the end times have come about and why the Games Workshop company that produces this wonderful game of Warhammer has brought it to light. Please.
Absolutely. So, yes, it's a question that looms heavy on everyone's thoughts, right? Why did Games Workshop decide to do the end times? We could have done many other events, another Lustria or a Storm of Magic, but instead we decided to go with the end times. And this has been a huge event. These books, they're just rolling off the assembly line, well, maybe not in number, but certainly in speed. And and with them come all these portents of the destructions of armies and army books and everything else that we've come to know and love over 30 years of playing the game. So why do it? I think the answer to that is, cynically, one might say money. Well, sure, they're a business. Their goal is to make money, and certainly this does that. But I think that this represents a much more interesting move on the part of Games Workshop. I am going to, for once, give them the benefit of the doubt. I will take a positive attitude toward an oft maligned company and say that I think they're doing this because they wanted to give us what we wanted. And what we have said we wanted for a long time in watching reports and discussions and podcasts is we want change and action and stuff. We want more for the Warhammer world. We want to stop being ignored. And they said, all right, we'll give you what you want. We'll give you all you want and much more. And that was the end times. And I think this gives them a nice chance in a broader sense, you know, to speak more plainly. It gives them a nice chance to really do interesting things with the fluff that's been stagnant for a long time, and to reposition the world in a new way that they can now start telling new stories from. In comics, if everybody read a comic book for a really long time and there's an ongoing story, you know how it goes in the world of comics. Eventually, you got to punch that reset button, retcon it, and in some way start over because you just run out of stories to tell in that world. There's too much detritus dragging you down. That's my thought.
Well, Vincent, you know how much I respect your opinion, but I have to say that you are categorically incorrect. This End Times release is nothing more than a visceral attack by GW on the common player. We have had 30 years, as you've said, of story, of lore, of history that we have used to make the game ours. This is simply nothing but a grab to destroy that bedrock that our community has set upon and allow GW to reinforce their control over it by creating an entirely new lore that's unfamiliar.
There could be merits in what you say. I think that from a perspective of a fellow that has been involved in the Warhammer world for nigh on 20 years, it has recycled some of the same stories. Many of the characters in the older races still leg it out onto the battlefields even now in their age. And I think it is a combination of the two things that you say, that it is becoming a bit of a tired story for some, and it is certainly an opportunity to begin anew and hit the reset button, so to speak, and develop new storyline and maybe even go so far as to redefine some of the races and players in that Warhammer world.
Absolutely. I think in economics terms we would call this creative destruction. This is the only way you can make way for the new world is to burn down the old one in some regard, right? And that's exactly what this is. Yes, we will lose much of what we love, but come now. How does Karl Franz and Tyrion even show up in the story? I'm amazed that they can get onto the battlefield in their wheelchairs and walkers. They've been telling the same story and been around for so long. I mean, the medication alone. Does Tyrion lose his pillbox and not be able to show up to battle because he forgot to take, his heart medicine for that Thursday? These stories are tired. Get rid of them. It's time for new stuff.
And while I don't disagree, Vince, that new stories would be of benefit, you have to look at the more subtle play that Games Workshop is making here. It is not enough that they are erasing the history and rebuilding it, but they have built themselves in as a stand-in, an ultimate authority in each of these books. Can you honestly say to me that Nagash, the ultimate controller of the dead and the provider of all of this power, is anything short of a metaphor for GW itself and the level of control that it wants to have on the game and the community? This is repeated again, as we will no doubt deal with Glotkin in terms of, on both sides of the argument, in terms of the Glotkin and the actual deification of Karl Franz himself. And again in Kane with, again, a deification of Malekith. This is nothing more than a story framework built for Games Workshop to praise itself and to imprint that praise on the minds of the players.
So would you venture some guesses, perhaps, at what may be the outcome of this? Let me propose something first. I think for ages the Empire of Man has been the central figure in all of the Warhammer world, both geographically and story-wise. And it has always been involved in the conflicts of others, both within its borders and without. And I believe that if anything is to be the greater upheaval in all of this, it would be the Empire of Man, and they may become, perhaps for once, a minor player in all these effects rather than the major central affair. What are your feelings?
It is very possible. However, I think there is, again, more subtle movements in here simply than removing the Empire of Man and his agency. I think you can look at all of the Nagash book as an allegory for the current community. from the very beginning when it discusses the Lizardmen. These are the old guard, those who were drawn to the game for its order, for its balance, for the stories that have been built. These are representative of the players who have seen through the lies wove by GW. And the Exodus, very simply, it is these folks leaving the game, leaving the world, leaving it behind. And as you've seen in the Nagash book, they spend 2 pages on them, again indicating GW's lack of concern for those that it's leaving behind and reestablishing its own ownership. On the other hand, you have the Skaven, who are represented as well as being great conquerors with little forethought or action. They destroy Stalia and Tilea because they've embraced this new power that's being unleashed. These new kernels of story and energy that GW has done has given them the tools to conquer, not only to conquer, but to utterly eradicate those that stand before them. It's no simple mistake that these two are representative of 2 very different groups within the community. It's all a power allegory.
Well, an interesting proposition. What I would say is I think that you're right that there is allegory in the opening section with the Lizardmen, and it's when Mazdamundi says the plan has failed. And I think that's the allegory to GW. Their old plan and business model of how it went has failed, and now they realize it's time for a new one. As to what the end of this is, I am not a fortune teller, but here's what I know for sure. I am going to take GW at their word. Like, in the beginning of Nagash, we are given a very clear image of the future, of burnt bodies and lands in waste, and the very simple sentence, "This is the end times, though few believe it." Like, I am going to take them at their word. This is the end times, meaning this world, this thing we know, is over in some great way, and any hope we have of clinging to remnants of it is false. I don't think they're lying to us. I think they are telling us the truth from the first sentence of the first book. And though our conscience wants good to win, because we always do, I think in the end almost everything we know and love is in some way shattered. That doesn't mean that we don't get a new world that might not look and have echoes to what we've seen before. There's definitely remnants of a sort of Cylon, all of this has happened before and all of this will happen again sort of thing. But I think that this world and how we know it is over. That's my prediction for the end.
Well, very ominous indeed. Now, listeners, don't be afraid, because there are many tales to unfold here in the end times. So that is as lovely a segue as I could have asked for, my partner, to move on, and let's begin the narrative that is the end times Nagash. And for our viewers and listeners who are mildly familiar with this tome, we will be looking into today in this session the opening 2 chapters of End Times Nagash, which will lead through some discussion about each individual race as this affects the opening moves of the End Times, and then into the great ritual that would bring back into this world the great necromancer Nagash. So let us precursor this with what propagates the feeling of the end times. And this is by grand moves out of the north, where Archaon, the god man, who is to be created by a god and favored by all 4 of the chaos powers, has risen to gather all of the forces of chaos together with a definitive, once and for all, no half measures attack upon the old world. So as a player of the Chaos Army, Joshua, perhaps you can tell us the perspective and motivations behind this.
Well, it is simply the fundamental prophecy upon which the story is entirely built. It is the rising of the great evil, who will unite squabbling, who will unite divided forces into a centralized army that will bring an end to all that is. It is fitting that in chaos there is the foundation of all things, because I believe ultimately that is where the true agency of this story lies, and it will allow a woven and ever-changing narrative to slowly move us towards a great ending. If we are to believe and take these words at face value. But I would argue that the reason why it must be chaos as opposed to the forces of Nagash himself and the dead, who are the linchpin of this story, is that with the dead there is no continuation. There is no agency beyond that of Nagash. As Archaon, being a mortal man, even chosen and manipulated perhaps by the dark gods, there is a connection that the reader can have, can understand the motivations, the desire to rise up, to throw off the chains of the lies spread by so-called civilization, and to bring an end to it, a violent and bloody end. And I believe that is where we open up with the agency within the hands of chaos in this story.
So the motivations of Archaon, as a representative of the Chaos Gods, of course, is to conquer all of the known worlds of man so that they can hold their sway. As this build-up happens, and the opening saga of the end times comes to be, I would like to read a small passage and snippet here as this sort of builds to a boiling point. And it reads here: "Hour by hour, day by day, Archaon's army grew, his numbers swollen by traitors and madmen from the south. Yet still the Ever-Chosen made no move to march. Many chieftains grew restless. They chafed at the inactivity, and longed to raise their axes against the weak nations of the world. Some warred amongst themselves, but others led their tribes south in search of plunder and victory." Now, so I read that because there's a couple of instances where we can talk about the activities that Chaos already has going in the world before Archaon even makes a move south against his grand plan. For instance, demons popping up everywhere. Lustria, Ulthuan, on the doorsteps of the Dwarves. The Chosen of Khorne, Valkia, marches south upon Nagaroth to lay waste to their nation. So perhaps let's talk about that from the perspective of the Dark Elves first. Vincent, do you want to speak to what the Dark Elves have to do with this?
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, I think the Dark Elf section in the beginning of this is probably a couple of the most important pages in the book, especially given the most recent release, as this sets everything up. When Valkia comes in, she, I suppose she's still a she sort of spearheads south and just starts sweeping aside Dark Elves. They make, call of the fact that, like, most of the Dark Riders, who are supposed to be the supremely fast vanguard, don't even escape before they're plucked from their horses, right? And only finally, and too late, does word sort of arrive, and then, again, boom, 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 she's conquering her way. And this whole time, Malekith is out and about missing on an errand that none of the sort of Dark Council knows what exactly he's doing. And Valkia spearheads her way all the way across Nagaroth and finally besieges, all their main cities, splitting up her forces appropriately to besiege all their main cities when Malekith returns. And that's really when you actually get a much more interesting portion of the chapter, because then it sort of spins from this broad overview, 30,000-foot version of, like, armies marching and cities falling, to being this wonderful council chamber scene with Malekith. Actually, and the whole thing is from the point of view of his one of his counselors, who's sort of picking and weaving with you, taking you along for who is too strong, who wants to challenge Malekith, who needs to be executed, who needs to be chosen. It's a wonderful insight into the minds of the Dark Elves, and it very much sets up the later story in Cain, and talks about sort of their plans for the invasion of Ulthuan. And what I particularly like about it is it sort of sets various characters into motion around, various important characters within the Dark Elf hierarchy, so that they all have their little missions. But what I particularly like is the way it ends. It ends with this sense from this other character, again, who is looking at Malekith and sort of giving you, the reader, his perception of Malekith. It ends with this sense of that person that everything is fine. Malekith is here. He's going to crush Volkia. There will be no recompense for these chaos invaders. The Dark Elves will win, as they always have. Nothing can stand against Malekith. And once they've wiped this Khornite trash off of their lands, then they'll turn to the High Elves and have their final victory. And of course, not to jump too far forward, but we see later what an unreliable narrator this is. And I love the setup that it gives you the completely wrong impression at the end of this section. And that's why I love it. I think it sets up that all throughout this, we often have unreliable narrators who give us basically false feelings and impressions and information about the story.
I absolutely agree, Vincent. I actually think one of the most masterful strokes in this story is how you go straight from that description of the Dark Elf Council meeting and the Dark Elves, who are ultimately a treacherous and dark-hearted people, putting their faith in their leader. Immediately on the next page of the High Elves, who are supposed to be trusting of their leaders and open and common, struggling under the loss of that leadership. And so you get an amazing juxtaposition of a strong leader versus an absent or weak leader, and how that even brings confusion and dare I even say it, sows chaos amongst the forces of order. And it was just a masterfully done stroke.
Yeah, and I think that's a very interesting thing that you bring up there, because it sort of brings closer together the ideal that these two races were in fact one race at one time, that they have aspects of one another there within. So as you said, Vince, that we have a situation where I believe it's Malice Darkblade, of a treacherous race that could think of nothing better most nights than putting a dagger through the back of Malekith himself so that he can take the reins. Yet when he appears after being when Malekith appears after being absent for a time, there is a sense of relief and unison, and our leader is here to finally save us from what could be doom. So that is the hope that one would generally associate with a High Elf race, and a trust in one another you generally associate with that. And then, as you say, Joshua, on the High Elf side, it's Finubar who locks himself in a room and hides from these horrors as Ulthuan is being ravaged by demon attacks. That the race is lost, and they fall into a bit of despair, which I would associate a little bit more with trying to figure it out on your own like a Dark Elf does. So, very good insight.
I think that's an excellent point, Mitt. Even to the point where you see that the Dark Elves, even the most traitorous among them, unify perfectly, right? And all accept the roles given to them. But what happens with the High Elves? The most potent among them decides, I want no part of this, and washes his hands and denies the would-be leader, and Imric just leaves and says, you all have defense of the realm, I will hold to my lands and nothing more. So it's shown that the High Elves are the ones who can't even hold their own group together, even in the face of a very sort of ordained leader at the hands of the Phoenix Guard.
And I would even argue that it's more than that, Vincent. In the particular sidebar on the following page, when it discusses the meeting between Teclis and Tyrion, we see yet again the manipulation and the betrayal that actually seems to be inherent in the High Elf race and not the Dark Elves. you see the primary betrayer in this story is not Malekith. It is not even Marathi. It is Teclis, manipulating not only his own people and the Dark Elves, but violating that bond of brotherhood and bond of family to accomplish his own goals. It is presenting a heartless beast at the center of the Elven Empire, and very much in opposition to how we have been led through the lore up to this point to consider that particular race.
Now, we do have to pause on this for a moment, because this exchange between Teclis and Tyrion is the first snippets that we have of the eventual goal that is leading up here within the End Times, and why it's titled The End Times of Nagash. So we have to present the idea that one of the key things that Tyrion is most concerned about is that his daughter, Aliathra, who is his daughter secretly to most of the High Elf nation, but with the Everqueen Alarielle, had been kidnapped and spirited away by Manfred Von Karstein months before. And there already had been a prior failed rescue attempt to bring Aliathra back to Ulthuan by Tyrion himself and Teclis and a few others. And so the exchange here that Joshua brings light to is the struggles that Tyrion first has to face about his loyalties to his child, his secret child, I should add, or his entire populace. It is a fear from the High Elves that Aliathra is to be used by Manfred von Karstein in some sort of nefarious act, but the full scope of that is yet to be revealed.
One of the things that I think we really do have to reference here, Kieran, and I do have to go to a slightly older source material for this, but the text known as Sigmar's Blood. It brings to the forefront this plan by the von Karsteins, and even more so, I think that is ultimately, along with several of the small snippets in the recent army books, of starting to unravel the base connections between the forces of order that destabilize the world to its current point. If you followed the tale of the Everchild being captured, it's not only the elves that attempt to rescue her. There is a point where the dwarves assisted in that rescue and actually had possession of the Everchild for a certain point. And at this point, where there could have been a union and a re-strengthening of the two elder races of order, there was a upsetting, and the Everchild was taken, and it proved that the bonds that had once kept the forces of chaos and the forces of evil at bay have been left wanting. And so it's that weakness that we're building on, that those cracks that are now getting to fester, that we see here through the texts of the early parts of the Nagash book.
But it didn't start that way. The intentions of the dwarfs were good initially, because at the time that Aliathra was the envoy of Ulthuan to try to mend those times, she was sent effectively as an ambassador of the Elves to mend those ties from that would last maybe back to the War of the Beard or the War of Vengeance, depending on what side of the fence you were when it was named.
Well, absolutely. I'm not saying that the dwarves were at fault. What I'm saying is that what the authors are accomplishing here is simply putting forth the kernel that the old alliances have not the strength to face this new time. We have already been shown that the elves and the dwarves, their time is over. There is no union there that is going to stand against the evil that is coming. And so now we are left with truly, particularly now that we see the beginnings of the disintegration internally of the High Elves, we are left only with the realms of man to act as a bulwark against the darkness that's coming.
Right. So let's maybe move and we'll talk about the role that the Empire has to play in this, because as I alluded to earlier, they always have been the central notion, both geographically and storyline-wise. So, Vincent, would you like to take up the mantle of what it is that the Empire has to play in the opening salvos?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you read through the Empire portion, it's a very long list of all of the horrors that you could imagine befalling a nation, right? When it sort of picks up and it talks about, the twin-tailed comet coming and being seen very at first as sort of this this boon, and then very quickly it's obviously shown to be a bane, and all of this disease spreads and sickness, and demons start attacking everywhere, like left and right. Beastmen are assaulting from the woods. Villages are disappearing. And you've got, people growing fat and wealthy off of selling false cures for these sicknesses and diseases that are getting that are spreading through the populace. And so all of this is just going bad. I believe this is even the part where Nuln is basically collapses in on itself, which is always nice. And then in the middle of all of that comes the writers from Kislev, and they say, "Oh, hey, by the way, just wanted to let you know, the Tsarina sends her regards and says that she'll see you in the afterlife because we're done for." And the Emperor even remarks that he expected the Ice Queen to invoke this old pact of defense, and the writer says, "Nope, don't worry about it. We're done for. We're just telling you so you have a chance." And I think that really sets the stage quite well for then what comes next, because what you get is this immediate realization from the point of view of Karl Franz that, okay, as much as I thought maybe Sylvania was a threat and I wanted to head down there and give them what for finally, nope, we've got to go deal with this. And then you encounter all the issues where he tries to send men north, and I think basically the number it gives is something like only for every 10 he sends, 7 make it, because 3 die to disease or attacks or whatever else befalls them on the way up there. And it just shows that Franz is trying to push the entire might of the Empire up to this northern border to halt what he knows is this oncoming storm, because he understands that anything that just knocks over Kislev like it's not even there is going to require all of his attention. And then we get one of the most sort of out of place and odd, but portentous, I guess, scenes in the book. What seems very out of place at the moment you read it, which is Balthazar Gelt, the head of the College of Wizardry, the metal mage, as it were, sitting down and speaking to this sort of very enigmatic shadowed woman who offers him basically the silver bullet to solve all of his problems. He had recently built a big, magic wall of holiness, a holy wall of holy holiness around Sylvania, for lack of a better term. And she says, "Oh, you could do the same thing around the north and keep out chaos," something to that effect. And he says, "I don't think that would be possible." And then she says, "Oh, but it is," and gives him this little scroll, and we kind of end it right there. And that's sort of the end of the Empire.
Introduces and that's one of the key characters that leads to be something much bigger than we'd ever thought he would be, is Balthasar Gelt, the Supreme Patriarch. It's in fact Volkmar that builds the barrier around Sylvania. When Sylvania gets a little bit uppity and they start to become more recognizing of Manfred's movings and maneuvers, this is probably worth a segue here to say that while this is all going on and we're discussing what's happening with chaos rampaging around the world, Manfred von Karstein within the Empire is sending out to collect relics of Nagash. and bring them back to Sylvania. This causes Volkmar, the Grand Theogenist, to investigate further, and he devises some sort of wall of faith that effectively seals in Sylvania. And this, what Vince brings up, is a little notion from this secret spy to tell Gelk that he can do the very same thing to keep out the realms of chaos from the north. I also want to say, before we move away from that snippet about Kislev is a piece of writing that kind of comes up again and again in the end times, and it's a paragraph, it's maybe 2 paragraphs that talks about Kislev in this whole thing. But the writing style is just so absolute and just so matter of fact that it just says, oh, well, Kislev's done now. Kislev doesn't exist. And let's move on and talk about some other guy. Which I think is shocking, but how do you feel about that as a piece of writing overall?
Well, I think to accomplish what the authors are looking for, they have to go that, I will use the word heartless with it. They have, in 2 paragraphs, not only completely gutted one of what was a strong ally of the Empire and therefore destabilized that, but in the greater allegorical meaning of this book, destroyed those who had faith from the times when Kislev was an active part of both the game and the lore world. They have, without so much as a by your leave, cut the head off of any hopes that those people might have of seeing Kislev restored to glory. And it is that kind of visceral strike that I think provides the power to this. And we'll see that echoed again in the discussions of Estalia and Tilea. It is, they are very thin on the verbiage, but very, perhaps not cruel, but purposeful in that language. It is struck to simply destroy any chance of argument or hope that might stem from it.
Yeah. I like it as a mechanism, actually. I quite like that it's just very cut and concise and matter of fact, and let's not bear thinking about it or lamenting it. We just have to think about other things, and it's almost treated just like that, right? So, speaking of things that are very short and cut, let's discuss briefly the Beastmen, as they live predominantly in the forests of Drakwild in the Empire and other forests around the Old World. Very central, but yet so far away from anything important. These poor Beastmen. Do you have any thoughts about this race of chaos?
I do, and I find it very interesting, the juxtaposition of the writing style between this segment and that earlier when it discusses chaos, in that there is a person of agency in the early chaos writings. It is Archaon, it is moving. But if you look through this reading, and it is simply a page, there is no individual here. There is no source of agency within the Beastmen. They are
just a racial entity that moves along and pushes through with or without any guidance. Although they do reference a character named Malagor, who seems to be in touch with chaos as a whole, and pushes that along. But it's difficult to imagine any important role that these fellows would play, other than to just be the garbage men of the Warhammer world, in a way. They don't do much more than that. Vincent, do you have anything to add to the Beastmen narrative?
They get short shrifted in this early part, to be very blunt. They get about nothing, yes. It's almost as though, like, hey, also, there are Beastmen. Great.
It does feel that way, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so we'll spend about as much time on them as Games Workshop did in this book, maybe. Well, let's then move in and we'll talk about the great Beastman enemy, the Wood Elves. Now, the Wood Elves in this has always been a bit of a secluded race that hasn't bothered too much with messing around with the rest of the Warhammer world, aside from allying with Bretonnia at times in their times of need and chasing Beastmen off of their borders. So, in the opening of this, there's a couple of things that go on with them, though, and that is that, and we'll segue into talking a little bit deeper about Bretonnia in a moment. But Bretonnia is in turmoil once again, and they're in their own civil war for various reasons. And the Elves have a part to play in that, as they ally with them, and Orion goes out and rampages across the fields of Bretonnia, trampling down their enemies for them. But in the meantime, as the season gets on, what commonly happens in the Wood Elf storyline is both Orion and Ariel, who are both incarnations of their own gods and goddesses, go to sleep for winter. But this time, Ariel is having the biggest struggle of all. They are convinced that she is just plain old dying. So, in steps Ilariel, who is the Ever-Queen of Ulthuan, to come in, and the Elves appeal to her to do something about restoring Ariel and helping her beyond her usual need. So she appears there, using the world routes to travel from Ulthuan to the middle of Adaloran, and there's a pact that's made that otherwise wouldn't be made because the Wood Elves are insular and not trusting, even of other elves. But the pact is made that if Lariel does her efforts to restore Ariel, their mother, then the Wood Elves will send someone to join in on the rescue of Aliathra, again, from the clutches of Manfred Von Karstein. So that's a bit of an interesting pact, I think. Knowing what you do about Wood Elves and High Elves, Vincent, do you have any light to shed on that?
My favorite part about this entire scene is actually the conversation between the Ever-Queen and the twins, as it were, which I'm going to butcher their names, but Naestra and Arahan, I think. I'm not very good with Elvish names, I apologize.
I think you got that one.
Okay. Yes, between the twins, the eagle or dragon riding twins of great fame in the game. I love their conversation because in this case, it's not really anything that's being covered. I mean, they're talking about significant issues. They're talking about the Oak of the Ages dying and her need to heal it and so on and so forth. But I just love the way that the two... There's a lot of movie scenes where they have twins or something like that, and they'll use those twins in this sort of sing-songy back-and-forth fashion of speech, and they managed to capture that very well here in this little bit. It's a wonderful little bit of color, the way Naestra and Arahan talk to the Ever-Queen, the way they sort of finish each other's sentences and thoughts. I just think it's one of the more fun passages to read, and that's not, that is worth something to me. I think it's absolutely worth noting when things are really enjoyable and well written, and that's what I love about this particular portion.
And I actually enjoy the fact that they have taken the twins as the voice here to deal with the Ever-Queen, because I think it sets it up in direct opposition to the disintegrating relationship between Tyrion and Teclis. And so we're presented as two different forces within the Wood Elves and the High Elves, this close familial connection, and we're seeing in one hand where it's disintegrating under the weight of the end times, and in the other it is staying strong and hopeful.
That's a good insight. See, and I almost saw it as a simpler level of those two characters, Arahan and Naestra, being sort of the good cop, bad cop roles in this, as they try to convince Ilariel that they need to help out. And then in the end, it's Durthu that comes in and steps in and says, "No, you need to do this. You need to help out this lady, so that she helps out your lady, and we all get along." That being sort of the dad settling the argument between the two daughters in a way.
It's a nice moment of clarity for Durthu too, who for a long time has been, this sort of obsessed with, rage and anger over his issues. I thought it was nice that they let him have that moment where he actually does drive the story in a good fashion.
Well,
and again, I think he steps in
on the borders of.
I was going to say.
Let's segue into talking about the much maligned Bretonnians, shall we? Because this one's a doozy.
Very well.
This one's a very big doozy. Who's excited about broaching this subject?
I'll give it to
I will definitely do this one. The amazing thing about this is one of the weaknesses of Bretonnia, I think, has always been perhaps an over-reliance on the Arthurian myths, and that's where we start off here. You're seeing the dark son of Bretonnia striking against his father. You're seeing the end of the Arthurian myth play itself out here, and the authors take they hold no holds barred in their decision to just destroy Bretonnia. But I think the important thing to note here is that as opposed to the Empire, where the destruction comes from without, with Bretonnia it comes from within. It is the sons of Bretonnia that are tearing itself apart, that are weakening itself. And you get this sense of the future being at risk in and of itself, because it is the future that is striking against the current king. And it is excellent in its depth of discussion of the just death and destruction that the war has brought. But unlike everything else here, we do have a spark of hope. After the king is struck down, the Green Knight comes forward as a hero that Bretonnia needs and takes out Malobad, the cursed and evil son, their Mordred, and reveals himself not only to be a hero for the future, but the greatest hero of Bretonnia's past. The original king returns. Now their greatest hero is at their helm, and even in the darkness there is a hope here that I think has been lacking from most of the other racial write-ups, which I think only heightens the irony of what is to come later in the terms of Bretonnia.
Yeah, it is sort of a shining spear that comes up out of all this doom, because we've talked about the races of good so far, how the elves are beset, their relations with the dwarves are breaking down. The wood elves in their own forests have their mother dying, and they're desperate to cling on to do something to save her. Even in Bretonnia, the whole story is that, internal civil war brings them to their knees. And then we have this shining spear of the return of the greatest of old, Gilles Le Breton, to take the helm once again. It sort of brings it all back, and it doesn't take much to give people hope in the Warhammer world, and this is one thing that I think strongly does.
Let me say one thing here. This is the greatest moment in the book. This is the moment that made me realize that that all those Bretonnian players out there, all of you people who play Bretonnia, we speak to you directly for a moment. You have nothing to fear. You have nothing to fear. They tell you directly. Bretonnia would write out, all this stuff. This is the moment where I was like, everything's okay. And it made me more realize that this is all just a cyclical thing. I talked about the end of the world and the birth of the new one and all that. Look, if you bring back the guy who founded your kingdom and he's supposed to light your darkest hour, I've watched Transformers the movie. I know that you're going to have to go through Unicron first before you get out the other side. But the reality is, once you do, then this guy is going to be around and he's going to found a new Britonia. So we'll have a second Britonia at the hands of its original founder. That's why they brought him back. That's the story that's being set up here. Of all of the nations, Britonia has the least to fear. That is my firm belief in this.
Yeah. Good. Now, in this tale of Britonia, I have a couple of things that I think are important as we sort of develop the overarching story. And that is that there is agents at work here behind the scenes. If you want to think about where Malabode came from and why there was a civil war in Britonia, well, it's all by the manipulations of our old friend from the Hekara named Archon the Black and his partner Heinrich Kemmler, who actually prop up this Malabode, who turns out to be vampiric, to lead against that revolt. So this is the first stages that we see in the storyline of the agents of Nagash bringing things towards his focus. They do have some reasons to be in Britonia. We will reveal a little bit later about why it is that it's important for Britonia to be weak at the time that they resuscitate Nagash. But Archon the Black is there and of old comes back to do some very exciting things from behind the scenes. The other thing that I wanted to point out here is at the tail end of it, when we talk about the final battle where the Civil War is sort of coming to a close and Britonia is wrestling back control and Gilles Le Breton lops off Malabode's head and puts an end to it. The Wood Elves are also involved, and Orion is rampaging around. But there's this one little snippet here at the end of it that you don't quite catch unless you really pay attention, and that is that they say that the Lady of the Lake is stolen away by none other than Drika, the Dryad. Now, I kind of thought this was a bit of slip it in there weak writing that didn't really have any kind of a build-up to it at all. Maybe it was along the same lines as the Kislev thing, just saying, hey, by the way, these two really important people in the Warhammer world did something. And now we're going to move on to the rest of the story and leave you hanging with that. I felt a bit empty after that one. So, guys have any other thoughts about Britonia before we move away from them?
The only other thing I'll say is they also do highlight a lot of chaos attacking Britonia at the same time, which is going to become relevant later when we start talking about Archon and the story he gets into, when he starts realizing the strings being pulled against him as well as by him.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we still have to talk about the other agent of good, and we touched on him a little bit earlier, and that's the Dwarves. So where we left them is that they had a part to play in Aliathra and her kidnapping to Manfred, and they sort of have a bit of a struggle amongst their leaders about what to do about this. They are beset by chaos. They have demons at their gates. They have Skaven at their feet, and they have goblins running rampant in their tunnels. This is the age-old story that, quite frankly, is getting a little bit boring about the dwarfs, is that, you know, it's all woe and we're a dying race, but we're not willing to do anything about it because we won't change our ways and we won't accept that things are changing around us. But we have a couple of characters that actually butt heads about that here in the dwarf narrative. And unfortunately, the old salty stay at home and plant our feet on the ground and hold up inside our mountains is the kind of argument that wins over. So that leaves us with dwarfs doing nothing again. You guys have any other insights to that as to other ways you think that might play out?
Well, I think ultimately, historically, the dwarves' story is, perhaps the best word to use would be a slow-boiling one. The character of Thorgrim Grudgebearer is presented in the general dwarvish texts as being a sort of a breath of fresh air. And so I think what it represents here is even he is having trouble struggling under the weight of the dwarven society. And I think this whole discord between the dwarves is put there to illustrate the need for a breakaway, for something traumatic and destructive to happen to that dwarven way of life to crack them out of their shell. And so I think that's what we're being left with is the dwarves are ultimately the turtle pulling his head into his shell, and I think ultimately that will be found wanting as well. There will be no way for them to avoid this, and so what we are likely to see as the story progresses past the books that we're at now, I think we're going to see the dwarves having to reinvent themselves, and we will see a dwarven race that is very much different from what we're used to, because they will have been proven that that way does not work. That tradition of hiding and isolation will ultimately be defeated.
I think that's a hopeful way of thinking of things. I hope you're right, though, to be honest, because that is, as I said, a bit of a boring narrative, that they're just going to hole up and turtle and hope that the world passes them by and leaves them alone. It's a defeatist attitude.
I find this chapter one of the most depressing, coming off of one of the best, the most highest hopes. Frankly, I find this short section more depressing than the Beastmen section. At least it had energy to it. This is literally just, we're dwarves, we're dour, even by the standards of our race, this is dour times. Yep, things are bad.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we'll see a little bit later on that some dwarfs do actually come out of their hole, but that's certainly not the norm, certainly not their attitude about it. Now, on the other hand, a race that's always moving around, let's touch on the Orcs and the Goblins. Now, in their narrative here, they discuss the fact that Wurzag, the crazy orc shaman, has been whacked on the head by Mork a number of times and has his visitations from Gork as well. And they all talk to him in his weird ways, and the green energy that swirls around him tells him that the leader into the next new world and the great wogs are going to come from not one great warlord, but two heads. And I'll try to find the passage in here where he sort of spells it out. But
do you mind if Kieran? I have it right in front of me.
Oh, go to it. Yes.
Dimly, Wurzag began to realize that perhaps he sought not one almighty war boss, but two, a fist of Gork and a hand of Mork. I believe, is that what you're looking for, I believe?
That's what I'm looking for. So, in other words, we kind of think that he's looking for brute force and cunning.
Yes.
And that can't ever come from within the form of one single being in the orc or goblin universe. Which kind of leads me to think, when I first read this, that I think that he's propping up Grimgor of old, our massive beater that just wailing around with his big axe, and the most cunning of the cunningest schemers, Skarsnik, would be the one that comes to mind. And although the tough thing to fathom here, though, is two great warlords of orc and goblin tribes ever figuring out how to work together. That's just not their way. Yeah. That could be
one
as
goes
much,
north, one goes south, and don't talk again until they meet on the other side.
Yeah, that could be.
Strangely enough, you mentioned earlier, Vincent, that you thought the Bretonians were the most hopeful section of the book. I would actually offer this up as one of the more hopeful sections as well, both in terms of the uniting of the two greenskin races as under the watchful guise of Wurzag in this sort of moment of prophecy. I think for the Orcs and Goblins, this is a very positive, very hopeful view. But even if we go back to the sort of allegorical play that I had proposed earlier, I think this is GW telling the Orc and Goblin players that it's going to be all right. Your army is not going to be split apart. Your army is not going to be radically changed by these end times. What you're going to see is the continued union of the Orcs and the Goblins as a single force. And I think for this text, that is a very hopeful message.
I agree. You know, an interesting point about, or here's an interesting note. So amongst many tribal groups in South America, there is no word or concept of suicide because there is no concept of utter depression that would grip one to such a level and make one take one's own life. And I don't want to draw ill comparisons between tribal people and the orcs of Warhammer, but I can't imagine that orcs have a word for suicide either. If there is any race that is filled with positive energy and is always hopeful for what fighting tomorrow might bring, it is the Greenskins. I think they could rip out these 2 pages and just literally have the word "wah" written in giant, 78 font block letters, and I would have gotten the same impression and felt the same positive attitude.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is a wonderful thing. They've always been a fun race because they're simple and they're straightforward. You know what you're going to get out of them, and I think it's a very good concept that they would bring them to work together, sort of like dogs and cats living together in the same house. Unbelievable for some, but it can happen. Good. Okay, well let's move on to talk about our friends far to the east then. When we talk about the kingdoms of the ogres. Maybe one of you fellows would like to take the lead on this and describe to us what's happening.
There can be only one person talking about ogres. Mitt, go right ahead.
Yeah.
I thank you. With the ogres, we see, interestingly enough, at the entrance to all of this, the ogres are already beset with chaos. You're seeing the ogre kingdom itself beginning to break apart. It specifically says, and I'll quote, the ogres were no longer acting like a unified kingdom, however breaking apart into many different factions rather than a single nation. So you're seeing at the beginning of this a breakdown that Greasus Goldtooth is no longer able to maintain his grip over the various ogre tribes. And again, we see the same reoccurring theme of leadership that is left wanting. The ogre over-tyrant is unable to maintain his kingdom. Now, where the story is interesting and changes here, the chaos, as opposed to manifesting in forms of battles and what have you in many of the other worlds, or the other armies, is representing itself within the tectonic activity, the volcanic activity of the world. And you're seeing literally nature itself act against the ogre people. But, interestingly enough, rather than breaking them apart, as all of the others have been presented, with the exception of the orcs and goblins, these volcanoes exploding, and even the Firemouth, which is one of the ogre gods, bellowing flames, actually draws the ogre kingdoms together and forges them into a single migration, perhaps the greatest since they originally left the lands west of Cathay. And so it's very interesting to me that you have the opposite trajectory from chaos to order for the ogres than you do for most of the other races here.
What I thought was an interesting snippet in here was when all these ogre tribes start to split away and start to take off, Greasus is all upset about this, and he's like, they're slipping through my fingers. We got to gain control and bring them back. And so he sends out envoys to sort of reimpose his will. And then eventually, in a really simple passage, it says, and then it happened. Even as Greasus gathered his tribes to set out on the trail of recently departed traders, the Firemouth erupted. So what this says is that even Greasus just kind of gave up, and he said, well, I guess if everybody's leaving me, I better go too. It's a little bit of sadness for him.
Perhaps, but I think ultimately that's where the peace for the ogres are. They are a simple people, and I think it is there is peace in action for them, and I think that's it. Greasus is setting aside his concerns for the power when he has been shown so obviously a greater power in the form of the Firemouth erupting. And so he is, probably for the first time since he became the over tyrant, acting as a true ogre and moving forward and simply acting.
Yeah, and so this brings the ogres to moving to the west because they've been a bit separated from the main action geographically of the Warhammer world, and so they're headed towards the Empire and towards the World's Edge Mountains to hopefully play a bigger role in other people's actions.
We can only hope.
Yeah, I guess so. Okay, so always in other people's business, the Under Empire of the Skaven. Mr. Vince, I believe this is your territory.
Oh, we are firmly in my territory now, yes. You speak, of course, of the one true race, the victors at the end of all this, those who will stand alone upon a pile of broken bones of all good and evil who would oppose them, the verminous horde. Is that of who you speak? Or is that of who you speak? I think it is.
That is who I speak to, yes.
Yes. So, yeah, the Skaven chapter, I really do love this, and not just because I love Skaven to the core of my being, but it's a great chapter. It focuses just sort of at first on that the Skaven are swelling and that they tend to expand in these big tumultuous sort of bursts, and that's happening. You know, the race is just exploding in numbers. And here's the second example of the thing you referenced earlier. There's a simple sentence of, "So did the kingdoms of Tilia and Estalia fall, overwhelmed by a masterful campaign of sudden violence." Just like that.
Yeah,
Two
just done.
nations.
Finished. Cut.
Yeah, moving on. Got those handled. And I even love how it was so sudden that, not to jump ahead too much, but there's a moment later where Manfred goes into this territory and is surprised himself at the completeness to which these lands have been completely broken and destroyed. And you know, it sort of takes him aback, which I enjoy. So yes, they're basically taking up their big grand master plan, and then we come to one of my favorite scenes and sort of asides in the whole book. Finally, we get another close-up with some dialogue, and that is at the Council of 13. And so the Council of 13, for those uninformed in Skaven lore, 13 members. Really, it's 12, but the 13th chair is empty for the Horned Rat. It's sort of his ceremonial spot. And each of these chairs is occupied by a head, by the true head of sort of each clan, and they vie and scheme against each other for power and all these sorts of things. And we enter in one of their little discussions, and they're bickering amongst themselves, and the current sort of head of the council is basically popping off against Nurglich and saying, "Oh, I'm the one. I'm the voice of the Horned Rat. You have to listen to me." And then suddenly, piff! He dies in a big pillar of fire, of green warp fire, turns to ash, and then the 13th chair is now occupied. All of the Skaven hit their knees because they realize the Horned Rat has come, and he sort of psychically forces his brilliant plan into their heads, Nurglich primary amongst them, and they now see that like a new seer is destined to touch the pillar and join the council, and the line ends with "Children we shall inherit," and I love it. Yes, the Skaven plan unfolding.
Yes, as a man who appreciates the Skaven as well myself, I think this is a very portentous thing. Maybe as heavily weighted as some of the portents of the prior races. Because it's always such a grand plan with the Skaven, and it's always so absolute and convincing that no rat could ever think that it's going to fail. So it makes me a little bit excited and giddy looking forward to what possibilities can the Skaven come up with, and even more excited to what fantastic calamities and catastrophes they can create along the way.
Yeah, they are the wild card of the Warhammer world. They are truly the only race with no friends and all enemies, right? No one would ally with them. No one considers them friends, and they consider no one else friends. And I love them. They're wacky, crazy, wild, explosive, psychotic, cannibalistic madmen that just get wound up and turned loose, and fun comes out the other side.
And I am in complete agreement with every statement you just made, Vince, but I think the one difference that this text adds to that plethora of descriptors is victorious. For the first time with the destruction of Tilia and Estalia, they have a major victory under their belt for all the world to see. And I think that is one of the biggest shakeups in my mind. Not necessarily the destruction of those two countries, but the brazenness at which the Skaven are compelled to act through this. I think that is a huge shakeup that definitely will show that there are things, major things, changing for this particular race in the future.
Yes, indeed. Well, the Skaven, I'm sure, will have a big part to play in the future of the end times by that big portent. But let's move on to a couple of the final and most important ones in the Nagash segment of things. Let's talk about the Tomb Kings and the Ever-King of Settra. Joshua, did you want to take the lead on these gentlemen? Oh, I'm afraid you've gone silent, sir.
I'm sorry, I hit my mute button. I actually will bow to this one on Vince, as I feel he has a more stable understanding of the army than I do, and could provide perhaps some more detailed breakdown of this.
Tomb Kings is a love, not perhaps as much of a love as Skaven, but this is about 8,000 points of Tomb Kings sitting right here. So, you know, I feel like I might have taken them once or twice out for a spin, taken my lady out for a little bit of a midnight stroll. Yeah. So, but this chapter all focuses around Settra, and you know, Settra the imperishable, the eternal king, the king of, I think it's like the king of a million years, or you know, all these sorts of things. He has a host of titles that I'm sure it would take a cadre of Lich Priest to record, and basically, what you know, this is just setting the stage for what's going to happen down the road in Chapter 3, basically. Settra sort of sees all of this coming and says, in a very Born Identity kind of way, he says, you know, get them up, get them all up, right? And then that leads to this wonderful little point where he sends out Kenteka, one of his High Lich Priests, the Hierophant of Khemri, and says, you know, go talk to the other Lich Priests, tell them it's time. And he walks in and says, all right, stop the presses. Who's that? It's Vicky Vale. Forget what you were doing. We got a new one. And he says, you know, wake up the people. How many are we supposed to wake up this time? All of them. All of them is how many you wake up. And that's like literally the ending sentence to that chapter. All of them, said Kentaka, as he turned straight out of the tomb once more, awaken all of them. And I think that sets the bar for what you know is coming. This is literally the full might of Nehekara being awoken and being driven to war.
Well, that's an important distinction to make, because the mortuary cult that raises up the Tomb Kings and the Princes from time to time, in the past millennia, have been only able to manage a sort of a cycle of them. So you might have like Dynasty number 1 that's active for a period of time, and then Dynasty number 2 takes over, while these guys got to tuck away and go back to sleep again, so to speak. So it does speak volumes when he says to wake up all of them, because that means every generation of every Tomb King, of every dynasty, of every kingdom. that has ever existed in Nehekara's long, long history. The other thing that I would like to say about Nehekara is, and most importantly, is this is Nagash's homeland, right? This is where he was born, and he came to be as the second son of at the time, the current king of Khemri. And maybe we'll go in the next chapter, we'll talk about the origins of Nagash, but that's why the Tomb Kings are the biggest of the players in this, is because that is Nagash's origin that comes from that land. Okay. So then, let us talk about the biggest player in all of this, leading up to the resurrection of Nagash, and that is the Vampire Counts. It is Manfred Von Karstein that is the biggest player in this thing, and who can tell me about this man's history?
I will take that away. Manfred von Karstein, as we meet him in this story, is a master manipulator. He is the power within Sylvania, stretching back to the rule of, or the end of the rule of Vlad, in that he was the hand at which Vlad was betrayed and led to ruin. And it's interesting, whereas we leave the pages of the Tomb Kings where they are coming to the height of their power, we find Manfred here in a state of impotence. He finds his lands surrounded by the holy wall placed by Balthazar Gelt. He is unable to leave. His power its extent is literally limited by a line drawn in the sand, and it is shown here that everything that he had set to do, he had completed. He captured the 9 godly vessels to lead towards Nagash's reconstitution. His plan went exactly as it was supposed to, and it was now all of a sudden this imprisonment that has brought all of his ambitions screeching to a halt. And I find it very appropriate that this is where we leave off in this summary, because I think it is the fortunes of Manfred von Karstein that switch at this point, and he ceases to become the active force to leave room for Nagash himself to take his place. First through the proxy of Arkan the Black, but then through the later pages of the book as his own power and force.
Yes, and he has had a couple of triumphs along the way, though, and that is that he has collected a few of the relics of Nagash leading up to his ambitions. He has also successfully stolen away with Aliathra and has her locked up in the dungeons of his castle. He also has turned his greatest enemy into his captive as well, in the form of Volkmar. So, in response to Volkmar putting up his wall of faith around there, he did in fact capture Volkmar and then establish his own Manfred-created wall of bone around Sylvania, saying that, well, if I can't leave, then you can't come in either. So he really has sort of isolated himself in response as well, while he stews on what his next move may be. Now, does anybody have some final thoughts about what's led up to this point, or any other further comments about the races in Warhammer?
My only other comments are, I wish we could have gotten a few more insights into just kind of little spotlights around the world at other moments that were more personal. Like in some of the races, like the Greenskins or those other races, I wish we had gotten little call-out sidebar boxes, you know, of some intimate conversations. I know it sounds funny, intimate conversations with Orcs and Goblins. But you know, just something that more personalized it. I found that I really wish with that Bretonnian section we could have gotten like a one-on-one between Giles or whatever, however you say his name, and Gills, I don't know.
Yeah.
And one of his like advisors, just some brief conversation of him getting that, and just that sort of heavy as the head that wears the crown of the king. Something like that to humanize it. I mean, it's not that we don't see that later, but I just would have liked a little more of that sort of thing.
Absolutely agreed.
So, Joshua, do you have a character or a moment in this opening chapter that you really identify with and tickles you?
For me, I draw back to my first love, the Ogres. I think the chapter of sort of the reverse of that chaos to order movement from them really embodies their neutral place within the lore. And the fact that it is not the forces of the demons, it is not the forces of chaos that have to move them, it is the world itself must push the ogres because nothing else is grandiose enough to.
Indeed. Well, and I think that I identify with this little snippet of dialogue with Balthasar Gelt out of this opening chapter, for the simple reason that he's a character of some nobility, but he is a man, and I think that this is a sort of a foreshadowing to him about how a man has to make sacrifices and deal with things that he's unfamiliar with for the greater good of his nation. Tyrion has this struggle as well because he's asked to take control of the armies over there, but he's not really asked to compromise what his duties are in any nefarious ways. But yet Gelt is, and I think that that's an interesting piece of humanity, I think, that makes him an intriguing character.
Of course, I find it very interesting that you draw the connection between those two scenes, because in both scenes the men are communicating with one who is ultimately manipulating them.
Yes. Yeah, and it depends on how you choose, isn't it? Good. Well, I think, fellows, as we've had a good, solid discussion about this opening chapter, this may be a chance to refill our scotch and convene for a few moments. And for you viewers out there, I hope you have enjoyed this so far. I thank my esteemed fellows for all of their insights and wisdom that they've shared here. There will be more on this, of course, because the end times are only beginning. Tune in again.